Configuring the QoS of DDS entities. Configuring QoS policies for DDS entities. A DDS entity is a domain participant, also known as a participant, a publisher, subscriber, data writer, data reader, or topic. And there are multiple ways to set the QoS values of a DDS entity. Most of this is done at creation. So you can create a DDS entity with the documented default values for the QoS policies. You can create an entity specifying a crafted QoS profile. You can also hard code modified values of the QoS by using a QoS structure. So in code, you would have a QoS structure, initialize that structure with the values of the QoS, make a modification to the value of the structure, and then use that structure in the creation of the DDS entity. For some QoS values, you can change those values after you create the DDS entity. So every entity, every class has a getQoS and setQoS API. So you could use getQoS to get the current value of the QoS, then modify those QoS values in code, and then use the setQoS API to modify the or to change the values of the QoS. Now, not every DDS entity that you create will need to have their QoS changed. More likely than not, participants, data writers, and data readers will be created with modified QoSs. Now, sometimes you'll also need to modify the publisher and subscriber QoS values. However, the topic QoS, so topics also have QoSs, but it's really not a well-designed part of DDS. The topic QoS is only used kind of like as a reference, and unless you go out of your way, topic QoSs really have no effect on DDS behavior. So typically you'll just leave topics alone, topic QoSs alone, and changing the topic QoS really has no effect. Creating entities with a default QoS. To create entities, you would call a create entity API, create domain participant, create data reader, create data writer, create publisher, create subscriber, etc. For example, to create a data reader, you would call the create data reader API or a function call on a subscriber object. And this create data reader method takes in a data reader QoS. So you pass in a data reader QoS for which you create the data reader. There's a predefined constant that basically references the default QoS, DDS data reader QoS default, and that tells the create data reader method to use the default value of the data reader QoS policies in creating a data reader. Now that constant is available for all DDS entities. So there's a DDS data writer QoS default, there's DDS domain participant QoS default, DDS publisher QoS default, etc. And they'll be used in their respective create entity API to create those entities with whatever the default QoS is set for those entities. Typically or normally the default QoS value is the documented default. So it's whatever is being documented as the default value for the QoS policies for that entity. However, you can change what it means to be the default QoS by that's being used by the create API by setting is default QoS to be true. So the is default attribute can be set to be true for a defined QoS profile. So in XML, you can select one of the QoS profiles that you've defined in your XML and make the values configured for that QoS profile to become the default QoS values that's being referenced by the create API when that create API is passed the QoS default for that entity. So when you create an entity and that entity that function call is being passed the entity's QoS default constant, okay, instead of using the documented defaults, we can actually use a QoS profile that you've set with the is default QoS profiles true. However, this is not good practice. It's really not recommended. And the reason for that is when you're making that call, since there's always a default value defined, you're not going to be totally sure what values are being used to create that object. If DDS doesn't find a profile that has is default set to be true, well, there's always the documented defaults. We could use that instead. And then what if is default QoS is being set to be true on multiple QoS profiles? Which one are we using then? So it's not a great idea, even though we allow it, even though DDS allows this methodology of setting or changing the documented default to being a different set of default values, it's really not best practice to do that. Creating DDS entities with QoS profiles is the preferred or best practice way of creating DDS entities. You should always try to create an entity with a QoS profile, and you can do that with the Create Entity with Profile API. So this API is available for all DDS entities. Create participant with QoS with profile, create data reader with profile, create data writer with profile, for example. Now these create APIs actually exist for the languages that follow a factory object design pattern. So in a factory design pattern, you're using an object to create an object instead of using a constructor. In the modern C++ API, you actually use the classes or the entity classes constructor to create the object. And as a parameter into the constructor, you can populate that parameter with a QoS profile. So what does this look like in the factory API? Well, in the factory API, you have the create data writer with profile, and the publisher is the factory for creating data writers. Now, in this API, you're going to pass a library name and a profile name. This is different than what we saw previously. What we saw previously, you passed a writer QoS object. But here, because you're going to use a profile, you'll just pass a library name and a profile name that DDS will look up that profile and then use the contents to create that data writer. These libraries and profiles must already be defined, and they're actually loaded and stored in the domain participant factory. We'll be taking a look at that in more detail in the loading QoS profiles lesson. You can also create an entity with a QoS object. So, if you use get entity QoS, you can preload a QoS object with the initial values. You could also preload a QoS object using get entity QoS from profile. So you can take a defined QoS profile and load the value of that QoS object from the profile. When I say QoS object, I mean, for example, a DDS data writer QoS structure. The DDS writer QoS structure contains values for all the QoS policies defined for a data writer. There's also a DDS data reader QoS structure. There's also a DDS domain participant QoS structure. So those structures, you can initialize those values by using the get default QoS, get default data writer QoS, get default data reader QoS, and initialize those objects with the default values. And then you can modify the value that you want to be different and set those values. You can also get those values from a profile. So there's a get data writer QoS from profile, and this is something that you call on the domain participant factory, because the domain participant factory actually loads all those profiles. So now we're going to basically create this data writer object, or not create it, but initialize its value from a profile that's in the library as given by the profile name and library name. And now we use this data writer QoS object that we've initialized and modified or loaded from a profile in creating the data writer itself using the create data writer API. Now, changing a QoS value dynamically. All DDS entities have set QoS and get QoS APIs. Note, not all QoS policies can be changed. Only a few of these QoS policies can be changed dynamically. And as an example, we'll change a publisher QoS. The first thing we do is we're going to create a publisher QoS, and maybe we'll use the default QoS values to create the publisher. But later on, as the system is running, we may call code to first get the current value of the publisher QoS from the publisher. And now, for example, we're setting the partition name. We're going to set new partitions. We're going to modify the partition QoS. And then after we've modified it in the partition QoS object, we'll use that object to do a set QoS, and setting the QoS will modify the partition QoS in this case for the publisher. So what are some best practices for setting the QoS values of DDS entities? Well, first, use QoS profiles to create DDS entities. So during development, you would use named profiles. You use a profile name and a library name to create DDS entities, even if those profiles have not yet fully been defined. And it's possible that you can't define what a profile is, the actual values that will be used for a profile at programming time. When you're doing coding, you may not know what those values should be, and you won't know until after testing. And even during deployment, those values might change. So a way to do this is just to use the empty profile name. So these are profiles, not empty profile name, but using QoS profiles that are essentially empty. They have not been defined yet. They're just placeholders so that the required QoSs can be configured after the application is compiled. When you're compiling the application, you actually need to use a name. So you could define and use these profiles that are essentially empty, and then later on they'll be filled in. In summary, there are multiple ways to configure the QoS policies of DDS entities. You can create them with default QoS values. You can also create them by specifying a defined QoS profile. You can create them using a QoS structure allocated in code and initialized in code. Now, QoS structures can also be initialized with a defined QoS profile. Some QoS policies can be modified dynamically after the object's been created. Overall, best practice is to always use a named QoS policy to create a DDS entity instead of creating a DDS entity using the default QoS value.